Our program this afternoon is the first in an 11-part series held in conjunction with the new special exhibition, Unlocking the Past, Immigrant Artifacts and the Stories They Tell. The program schedules are listed online. They are available at the front desk, and you may recognize the program. I meant to bring one up with me. You may recognize the schedule as a large postcard that you received in the mail at home. So we hope you'll be able to take a look at that and then also attend many other programs that we'll be having those through May of, here comes Julie/Vanna. This is what the postcard looks like, and if you don't have one, you're welcome to pick up another one at the front desk. And let's see. So take that or look online. We'll keep reminding you also through K-mail and through social media that there will be programs. Today, Mark Jantzen starts out that series of programs, and he will be speaking on the period of time prior to Mennonite immigration to North America, a time when connections between Mennonites in Polish Prussia and the Russian Empire were still vibrant. Mark has led over a dozen college or public tours to the Vistula Delta, often collaborating with John Thiessen, the director of Mennonite Library and Archives at Bethel College, who is with us today. And Mark's talk will be made all the richer by the relationships he's developed with colleagues in what is now Poland. Mark is the author of 2 books and the co-editor with John Thiessen of 4 other books. He's the author of numerous journal articles. Mark and John are co-directors of the Mennonite Polish Studies Association. In addition to these academic and research accomplishments, Mark holds degrees from Bethel College, Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, and the University of Notre Dame. He has lived and worked extensively in Europe, is a professor of history at Bethel College, and currently serves on the board of directors of Kaufman Museum. By the way, this isn't a requirement of every board member. Should you be a board member in the room and you're starting to sweat. But please help me welcome Mark Jantzen as he presents Brief Imperial Russian Sojourn, Lasting Mennonite Memories.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here and great to see this turnout. We want to talk today about the Russian Empire, which looms large in Mennonite memory, especially here on the Great Plains, where so many Mennonite immigrants who had Dutch, Polish, Prussian, and Russian background came here. The books written about this episode in Mennonite history fill a whole section of the library across the street. The University of Toronto Press has a special run of books that they publish, a special series just on Tsarist and Soviet Mennonite studies. A wide range of events to commemorate this immigration to here from there 150 years ago have already been held. Seen some of you at some of those, and there are many more planned, as we've heard. Next weekend in Manitoba, there's going to be a conference dedicated to this migration, and it's going to feature the screening of a new documentary that has been made with a budget of tens of thousands of dollars. And of course, we are here to mark the opening of a special exhibit on this event. Next year, we'll mark the 500th anniversary of the origins of the Anabaptist movement. And the group of Mennonites we are thinking about has roots, for the most part, that goes back that long, 500 years. So if we think about the scale of memory over 500 years, you'll find that most of our families spent a few exciting years or decades in the Netherlands before they fled persecution there to go to Poland, where they lived for 250 years. That would be sort of the red and white flag of Poland. The last 50 of those years were under Prussian rule because Prussia, Austria, and Russia partitioned Poland. And that started, so you can see here, they're starting to move from Poland, Prussia, into Russia. And then for this Mennonites in this area of the world, they were only in Russia for like 50, 60 years. And now they've been in the United States for 150. So is it a little odd that we spend so much time on 10% of this large time frame? Why does that have such a tug on our hearts? That's a question, obviously, that does not have a single or a simple answer. But I think something happened in those 50 years in the Russian Empire that did not happen in Poland or in Prussia or in the United States. And I think the key change is in how the community of Mennonites thought about itself in at least 4 areas. So one is when they moved to Russia, they were faced with new limits on the community boundaries. There were not the same kind of social relationships with neighbors that had existed in Poland. They developed some new ways of thinking theologically and cooperating with other non-Mennonites that they had not done before. They got engaged in a much deeper way in the project of education, and that provided new intellectual tools to think about the community and what they were doing. And they also developed quite a bit of wealth in Russia. So this is kind of the outline of where we're going. We put these 4 things together, and let's see what it does to this community. So first we got to get a little bit situated in Poland. This is the Vistula Delta on the left. So you can see in this area there's a large Mennonite settlement, lots of villages and congregations. If you'd follow this map down to the bottom and put it on top over here, you get the continuation of the river and additional Mennonite settlements. This village here that's highlighted is the origins of the Alexanderville and Hoffnungsau congregation. So I think that's kind of one of the largest groups in the area. But there's also lots of people who have roots up here and elsewhere along the river. So that's where the story starts, going all the way back to the 1500s. We want to think a little bit, here's what happens to Poland. So this is, again, here's our Mennonite settlement. It's just along this stretch of the river. And in 1772, this gets taken over by Prussia. This part goes to Russia. And, well, the map's a little complicated. The main thing is, from 1772 to 1795, Poland disappears. And it's taken over, and Mennonites, for the most part, are living in Prussia. So you have to know that history to kind of make sense of why Mennonites are moving around. If we go back to Poland, let's think about sort of what was the opening scene for Mennonites in Poland. What was community life like there? Mennonites lived in mixed villages with Lutherans, with Catholics. There were a few Jews. Most people spoke German. A few people spoke Polish. They did not have much education beyond a village school, what they attended with non-Mennonites. There were a few Mennonites living in or near cities. That was a minority. They probably had a little better education than people out in the rural area. In this context, the only place that religious formation happened was in your family or in your congregation. They did not run any institutions beyond the local congregation. Until 1772, there was no single Mennonite institution or meeting that brought all the Mennonites in Poland together ever. So they're isolated congregations or isolated groups of congregations. Out in the villages, they might be involved in politics, like being the local mayor. Wasn't terribly common, but it might happen, and these are very small villages. So, in the cities, of course, they had nothing to say. They're really second or third class citizens. They're kind of off a bit to the margins. Nonetheless, they cooperated a lot with their neighbors. So to keep the dikes functioning so they don't get flooded and to keep the roads functioning, they have to cooperate. And Mennonites are well integrated into that structure, but not so much into the politics. They did have a system of getting agreements with the kings, both Polish and Prussian kings. These were called charters of privilege. There'd simply be a set of laws. Here are laws that apply only to Mennonites. And Mennonites would negotiate these things and make financial payments to kind of grease the wheels so that this all worked. So Mennonites were used to negotiating politically. They certainly knew how to do that. They tended not to marry outside of Mennonite circles much, although it happened on occasion. But starting in 1772 with the partitions of Poland, the political framework changed, and by 1789 it became illegal or impossible legally to marry a non-Mennonite and maintain your Mennonite status. So the social boundaries are getting much tighter even before they move to Russia. So this is kind of how things start. And then, so now we're at 1772, we have these partitions. What happens next? By the late 1780s, Mennonites are moving to the Russian Empire. The first colony is Kortitsa, the second larger one is Molochna, and I'm just a little curious in this crowd, who has roots in their family that they know of that goes back to Kortitsa? So I'm seeing not quite a dozen hands. And who has roots that go back to Molochna? Yeah, so we're going to be interested in Molochna, but that also, Molochna starts in 1803. There's a large wave of migration there in the 1820s. And then people are leaving by the 1870s. So this is a group that has not spent that much time in Russia. So, there we go. What does this new community look like when they get established in Russia? The largest framework that is set out for them is set out for all colonists coming from anywhere in Europe to settle in Russia. Starting already in 1763, there's a framework for that. Mennonites do a little bit of negotiating, get their own charter of privileges in 1801. But most of these conditions are equal for all colonists who are coming in. And they include you have to settle in your colony. So in your district, you'll only have Mennonites, or over here you only have German Lutherans or German Catholics or Bulgarians or Greeks. You have to settle amongst your own people. You'll get the use of land for free. You can sell it to another Mennonite who lives there. You can rent it out, but you don't own it. You don't have a deed for it. It belongs to the colony, or it's kind of a group deed that's only for Mennonites. And those conditions continue until the 1870s. So now Mennonites are living for the first time only among other Mennonites. They're not as mixed. The Russian government had a separate bureaucracy for these people. It was called the Guardian's Office for Foreign Colonists. So it's a separate whole legal structure that deals with these immigrants. Mennonites are about 10% of the German speakers who moved to the Russian Empire. And as we've mentioned, there's other groups, Bulgarians and Greeks are nearby and so on, but they mostly relate to other German speakers if they happen to be in the area. So sometimes you're moving your congregations and setting up congregations in the colonies. Sometimes the government office for colonists appoints a Mennonite to an administrative position in that colony. And you're also expected to set up your own government, like vote for someone to be the mayor of your village, which they knew how to do, and they did that in Poland. That was really nothing new. And then you might have a district chief and so on. Now, what gets interesting is you've got a minister. Do you guys listen to your minister? I don't know. Then you've got your elected mayor. Do you listen to the politicians you elect? And then you have someone who's appointed with power. All three of these are Mennonite. So which Mennonite now is the boss? There's a lot of turmoil over that that we won't get into, but for the most part, Mennonites tend to side with or have to follow the one who is appointed by the government. And the example of this is a man named Johann Cornice, who is appointed, given a lot of authority, and he can actually remove ministers from their office if they cross him and so on. So if you're a bad Mennonite, you would, of course, there aren't any bad Mennonites here, but if you're a bad Mennonite, the church says you no longer should be in our church because you've had a moral failing, you never come to church, whatever. You're still a Mennonite because you're still in this community. There's no way for you to leave this community. So you're still a Mennonite regardless of your religious standing. And this helps shift, I think, Mennonite identity to being that of a group that is created by a common social circumstance instead of a group that shares all the same theological commitments. That's an important shift. Another shift that happens here is in that original Charter of Privileges from 1801, kind of at the beginning, it's stated, well, why are we giving Mennonites their own set of laws? It's because in response to a request from the Mennonites, who according to their guardians, the government officials, could serve as a model to our other colonists in the area on account of their excellent work ethic and proper moral conduct. Does that sound like the Mennonites you know? So originally, nobody paid too much attention to this. I think it was just kind of rhetoric that was put in at the beginning of the document to get things started. But by the middle of the 1800s, this was given a lot of emphasis, and especially the word model, because it was used by the secular authorities, the appointed Mennonite political authorities, or sometimes the village or colony structures, to encourage Mennonites to do their duty. Since there was not possible, Mennonites were fractured into different religious groups. Some Mennonites were indifferent. They never went to church. So it becomes a kind of a way to encourage Mennonites socially to do the right thing, since there was no longer a common religious denominator to make that work. This meant that Mennonites now are seen, they see themselves, and others see them, as a model, somebody to follow. They're not working together with their neighbors the way they did to keep dikes up in Poland. So that's a shift. And over time, many ordinary Mennonites heard this charge to be a model as proof that they're superior to other groups. And locals, of course, resented always hearing about how great the Mennonites are, and they don't want to emulate them. So here you can find some seeds of animosity that really bear bitter fruit in the early 20th century. You can imagine now, think about Mennonites hearing all the time about how great they are, how they're models for other people. They hear that from Russian officials, they hear that from their own leaders, and they have a different self-image 50 years later than when they arrived as religious refugees from Poland. So that's the first significant shift. A related shift happens in the field of theology and religion. Here, Mennonites developed a new openness to outside theological impulses and cooperation that changed their theological boundaries. Back in Poland, I think Mennonites got along pretty well with the Protestants and Catholics in their villages. Day to day, there doesn't seem to have been a whole lot of friction, maybe some. But Protestant and Catholic clergy in Poland were forever going after Mennonites, trying to get more money out of them, calling for their expulsion, harassing Mennonites, public worship in different ways. So there was not much incentive to cooperate with sort of ordinary priests or Protestant pastors. But that changed when a new style of religiosity came to Protestants. It's known as Pietism. And Pietism started in the 1600s as a response to sort of Protestant theology that was just very rigid. And some Protestants say, no, we want a religion that's more lively. We want to speak to God from our heart. We want to believe in the Bible. We want more joy in our worship. We want different kind of music. We want a Bible and a religion that cares about the lost and that cares about the poor. So pietism becomes a important movement in Protestantism. In one case, it sort of overtakes a smaller existing denomination known as the Moravian Brethren. They now become entirely pietist. Other pietists just stay in their Protestant churches and sort of enliven or push these new themes among state Protestants. And Mennonites resonate with some of these themes. So they now start to think, gosh, I wonder if we could cooperate with these Protestants who are different than the ones who are harassing us. And one important place where they sort of test drive this is in the village is called Brenkenholzwalde. Here, this is a Polish map, so if you want to find it today in Poland, it's over here. You're like, where on earth is this? This over here, the bottom left corner, is the modern day German city of Frankfurt an der Oder. This is the German-Polish border today. So they've moved a long ways west in the 1750s because they had trouble with their Polish landlord, and they kind of booted them out. And they got a new lease on a whole bunch of land over here, and so a number of families moved from the valley over to here, and they're very isolated. This is a long ways away from all the other Mennonites. So they had a kind of a different setting there. They got their own charter of privilege. And then the Napoleonic Wars hit in the 1790s. Lots of pressure to go to the military. This Lutheran in the village, a man named Wilhelm Long, is like, I don't want to go fight. Well, for Lutherans, you kind of have to. So he's like, well, what if I join the Mennonite church? So he does. That's possible here. Would have been more difficult back in the Vistula Valley. So he joins. He's their village school teacher. He's probably the best educated person there. He becomes their preacher in 1802. 1810, he's elected the elder, the leader of the congregation. His sermons emphasize the need for salvation, for a personal connection with God. They're typical pietist themes that Mennonites, of course, would be happy to listen to. And some local Lutherans start to attend this Mennonite church because they like to hear that kind of preaching. One of the first things he does when he's in charge of this Mennonite congregation is he invites a leader from the Moravian Brethren, like a pastor. His name was Gottlieb Jahr, and they go visit Mennonite congregations back up and down the Vistula Valley. And they're telling them about some new opportunities. We could be involved in a Bible society. Let's collect money and buy Bibles for people who don't have them. And so they decide, in 1814, there are votes in congregations back in the Vistula Valley deciding to allow members to join these societies. The London or Berlin Bible Society, years on down the road, Mennonites will join the Russian Bible Society. There's a lot of non-Mennonites in those societies. Should Mennonites be joining with non-Mennonites? That's controversial. In the congregation of Heubuden, the congregation agrees this is a congregational project. They give congregational funds. Most other congregations simply agree that Mennonites can join individually, but we really don't know if that's a good idea. I think it's a type of incipient Mennonite individualism in religious matters. Mennonites are going to do their own thing. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. Well, in the 1820s, an English Baptist gets into that congregation in Brenkenholzwalde, and also he visits Mennonite congregations in Germany, and then he comes over here, and he visits, his name is Wilhelm Henry Angus, and he's telling Mennonites, you know, there are people in India who have never heard about Jesus. Would you give money for that? And they agree to do that. And so they start hosting large annual mission festivals that I think some of you might remember. This is the origins of annual mission festivals among Mennonites. They learned that from the Baptists. In the 1820s, there's a Danzig Mission Society that started with the help of some Mennonites. And by 1829, Mennonites are contributing 15% of the Danzig Mission Society's annual income that's going overseas for foreign missions. Mennonites are giving money to be used by Protestants to do their mission work. This is a big change. Mennonites used to be harassed by other Christians, and now they're being welcomed, sought out, praised, invited to participate in Christian activity with non-Mennonites. Some Mennonites are really enthused about this. Traditionalist Mennonites are deeply offended. So that's kind of interesting. Well, back after 1812, I don't know if you remember 1812 was the Napoleonic War, invasion of Russia, things are really tough, and the Prussian government's worried we don't want private meetings of any kind because those could be subversives meeting to support the French Revolution. So if you're a private meeting without government sanction, you're closed down. In Bregenholzwalde, that included the Mennonite Church. They were told, you're just a private organization. You're not an official church. That's not true. The local officials misread the law. Everywhere else, Mennonites would have written to the king or a high-ranking official and said, the idiot you appoint, they wouldn't say it that way, but the dummy you appointed here messed up your law, please straighten him out. In Bregenholzwalde, the local leader, Wilhelm Lange, just said, oh no, we're a branch of the Moravian Brethren. They'll allow us. So Mennonites for a while in Bregenholzwalde are under the Moravian Brethren to get legal permission to worship. And then in 1830, the Bregenholzwalde group faces new restrictions. They can't buy land anymore. They have to pay an extra 3% income tax if they want to stay out of the military. So the whole group picks up and moves to Molochna in 1834. And a number of these Lutheran families who've always been worshiping, they join the church at that point and join the migration. And they set up a new congregation in Molochna called Gnadenfeld. And at this point, Wilhelm Lange, their leader, is getting kind of old, so his nephew, Friedrich Lange, gets baptized. His nephew's still a Lutheran, like Wilhelm had been earlier. He gets baptized on his way to Gnadenfeld, joins a community where he's very well known, and becomes the preacher and the leader of the Gnadenfeld congregation shortly after Wilhelm's death in 1841. This new leader, Friedrich, brings along a friend. This man's name is Edward Wüst. He's a good friend of Friedrich. He's a pastor, a pietist, a Lutheran in the neighboring sort of Lutheran German colony. And so he's talking about pietist things, and this eventually attracts Mennonites in Molochna. And the very short version of that long story is by 1860, this kind of fervor starts a new Mennonite group known as the Mennonite Brethren. I've heard they've got a college up the road. It's a split between the Mennonite Brethren and those who stay, who are known as the churchly minded. So now we have Mennonites cooperating in ways that were just never done in Poland with Protestants, pietists especially. They saw, they borrowed, they created new avenues of engagement from and with other Christians. So just as the practices of living into a new social boundary altered and strengthened Mennonite communal identity, now they're struggling together to renew spiritual life and to mobilize Mennonites to support joint work out in the world while rallying behind various missions. It's a new way to be Mennonite. So we haven't had that in Poland. Mennonite Brethren. So now we got to think about education. Over 50 years in the Russian Empire, Mennonites really got interested in education. They created their own educational system from scratch, complete with staffing, resourcing, training. The roots of this system, of course, go back to the Vistula River Valley. If you go to a Mennonite school back in Poland, well, there really isn't one. Early days, there's talk of maybe a Mennonite school, village school in one village or the other, but none of them endure. They don't really have any significant impact. The best way to do education in Poland was with your neighbors. All the neighbors went to the same village school because it's cheaper than funding your own, just easier. But Mennonites, under Pietist influence, got the idea that you could use education to promote Christianity. So we'll have to see how that works. In 1826, members of the Danzig Mennonite Church and the Heubuden Mennonite Church, which is, well, you can almost see it on here. So Heubuden's down here. Danzig is way up, but close to the Heubuden Church. This is the bigger city of Marienburg, is over here. And in 1826, Mennonites start a new school in this little hamlet, Rodlaufer Huben. This is about the size of Zimmerdale, I think. It's like 4 houses together or something. But shows up on the map now because that's where Mennonites started a school. The first teacher there is the nephew of Wilhelm Lange, Friedrich Lange. He's still Lutheran, but he's hired to be the first teacher of a Mennonite school. So that's possible. It's a school, it's not a church, so that could be. He had helped start the Danzig Mission Society. He gets this school going. He's the one that brings in annual mission festivals. The Lutheran clergy in Marienburg here, who are traditionalists, they hate this. We're like, we don't want all this excitement right outside our town. They get the school closed down. And so they move north, several villages that would be off of this map, to a place called Bruskosfelde. And their mission festivals and school continued for decades and decades, into the 1880s. So 1862, a Mennonite school that's going to help students become better Christians. That's a start. In the 1820s, they also start something like that over in Brankenhoswalde, where they're already very familiar with Pietism. And here, they thought, they started doing child dedication services because the Moravian Brother did. And now they also add school. We'll do child dedication. We'll take our kids to a Christian school. This is the way to do faith formation. And Mennonites got this school started. They got a local farmer, Peter Jantzen. They're like, well, you got time in the winter. You could be the school teacher. So Peter Jantzen starts this school out of his house, a room in his house. And in 1831, the local school inspector comes around and says, where's your school certificate? Oops. Peter Jantzen's not certified to teach, so the school is closed down, and the students have to transfer over to the school in Rodlaufer Huben and later to Bruskosfelde. So they're trying, but they can't get it to work. Brankenhoswalde has another teacher. His name is Tobias Voth. He started teaching in the area. He actually got a teacher certification. He could have taught in Brankenhoswalde, but it paid better to go someplace else now that he's certified. So he just goes to a regular school in the city of Gdansk. There he marries a Lutheran girl, and they get converted to a Pietist understanding of faith by reading a Pietist scholar or author whose name was Jung Stilling. So just reading Pietist literature could get you on this. And then in 1820, Johann Cornies, who has all this authority in Molochna, knows about the certified school teacher. He's probably the only Mennonite certified school teacher in this time period. So he's called to Molochna, where he starts a school, a central school, a school above a village school in Orlauf in Molochna. He and Cornies don't get along. He's not there very long. They have a falling out. But his students learn to love higher education, which is always our dream. And he brought missions and mission festivals, a warm piety, a new style of music to Molochna. The school burned down, and it's closed until the 1860s. So activity moves elsewhere. There's a school, it was in Molochna, the village. Now there's a new school, and this is over in Kortice. This guy, Heinrich Franz, he's born back in the Vistula Valley near Schönsee. He's a member of one of the congregations in that valley. He was a student of Friedrich Lange back in Rodlaufer Huben. So you can see they start a school, they get bright students become teachers. He gets teacher certificates in both Prussia, and then when he moves to Russia, he gets certified there, certified to teach in 2 countries. Probably nobody in the room has that. So amazing what they do. And he's invited, he moves, when the village moves from Blankenholzwalde to Gnadenfeld in Molochna, he moves along and starts in the village school, and pretty soon he's hired away to Kortica to lead their secondary school. He develops a math or an arithmetic curriculum that's widely used in other village schools. He's developing new ways to teach. He borrows this idea and teaches it to Mennonites. You could actually sing in 4 parts if you understood the parts. Mennonites don't know anything about singing in 4 parts. It's like, oh, well, we can teach you. So this is what it would look like. Instead of writing the notes, you write the numbers. That's a lot easier to write out. This is Holy God, we praise your name in German and in numbers instead of notes. This version I got from a hymnal that was printed in 1994 in Frankenthal, Germany. So there are still Mennonite congregations singing this way. So this is a time and a place where Mennonites from the Russian tradition learned to sing 4-part harmony. That was new. They weren't doing it back in Poland or Prussia. In 1835, in Halbstadt, Molochna, they opened another secondary school. This time the government wanted it opened, not the Mennonites, and the government said, we need people who can talk Russian to staff our offices. And so they were going to provide Russian language instruction. All the rest was taught by Mennonites who had teacher certificates. And it wasn't until 1875 that Russian was actually introduced as a language of instruction. So until 1875 in a Mennonite school, you took Russian language as a foreign language, even though you're living in the Russian Empire, and your instruction was in German. When that was changed in 1875, people knew that was coming. It's one of the reasons. So a lot of us are here because our great-great-great-grandparents didn't want us to learn Russian. And they succeeded, so for the most part. So lots of schools are being built with the ability to train teachers, develop curriculum, do all of that. What is the impact, if you stop to think about it, of building a Mennonite education system from the ground up that encompasses not only village schools, but higher education system to train teachers? All of this focus on education produced a highly literate peasant population involved in its own administration. One historian has called Mennonite colonies the most literate periphery area of the entire Russian Empire, with more and better historical records than anywhere else. It is really unusual to have peasants that literate and that involved in administration. Beside the boon to historians, education plays an important role in reshaping how a community thinks about itself. An oral community might not reflect as much on change over time. Nobody kept track of it. A more traditional religious community might see itself as always living in God's time and in God's kingdom, and not account as much for innovations or influence from the outside. A community that builds its own education system that can obtain state certification has created the institutions and the proclivity to record and to attempt to steer its own history. If you're those kinds of people, someday you'll start a museum. Some of these early prominent school teachers were also the first historians for Mennonites. A community that with a recorded history measures itself differently against the past or the present than a community that sees itself as always just directly linked to God and not to a social environment. Historians have noted that in the first half of the 19th century, the rise of literacy, newspapers, and the connections thereby engendered created new communities of belonging among people who spoke the same language. So this is the rise of nationalism. Perhaps these same developments among Mennonite contributed to a new communal identity that went beyond the local congregation to include all Mennonites, making a new type of Mennonite identity possible that could be separated from a religious commitment. So that might have been going on in Russia, and it might have come here. Now we got to talk about money. Mennonites back in Poland and Prussia would have enjoyed a higher standard of living than most of the population, because most of the population are serfs of the nobility. They can't own their own land, and they don't control all of their own time. They have to work for others, basically without pay. So Mennonites were better off than that, but they weren't necessarily better off than other non-serf peasants. So there was a kind of equality across the villages among landowners back in Poland and Prussia. That really changed. This economic equality with your top neighbors changed when they got to Russia. Most Mennonites who arrived in the Russian Empire up until the 1830s were given 160 acres of land that they could use. We talked about this. It's yours to use. You just can't sell it outside the community. Other Mennonites received an 80 when they started to run out of line. A few came just to pursue a trade. And the ones who came really too late, they just got 3 acres and were told to build a house and start a garden and work for somebody else. So the Mennonites who came from the lowlands of Poland, which are wet, had developed intensive livestock operations, dairy cows, and they lived off of that. Perhaps a third of all the migrants to Russia came as craftsmen. This is not going to work on the steppes of Russia. There's no town to sell your dairy products. There's no town to sell your craft projects. So they had to develop a different way of life. Plus, they had a high birth rate, continued migration, population's growing, and the economy is not working. What do we do? They get settled in the beginning, kind of subsistence farming. Then there's Napoleonic Wars that last until 1815. The start is difficult. But then for the next couple of decades, they come up with a different idea, and this was sort of forced on them or suggested to them by Johann Cornys and the administrators above him. We should get back into this. I just think he's cute. Turns out if you raise merino wool, you get really nice wool. It brings 7 to 10 times the price of ordinary wool on the world market. So if you can raise this type of sheep, you make a lot more money per acre. Given the conditions on the steppe back then, you needed an acre to raise a single sheep. That is drier even than Kansas, I would think. But they got this going, and this is their first cash crop into the 1840s. Now, often, this is great. Now we're making money. We solved this problem. Well, as you know, often when you solve one problem, you create another problem you had not even thought about. And the problem they hadn't thought about is that you need land to graze, but you have new farm families coming who want to farm. And in Molochna especially, it was the owners who voted for the policies of the colony. So landowners voted to give themselves favorable leases on reserve land instead of giving that reserve land to families who didn't have any land at all. So the wealthy are kind of cooking the books in their favor. And the upshot was that Mennonites succeeded in increasing their income, and they succeeded in increasing the percentage of landless families among them. In 1839, in other German colonies, the landless were mostly young families just waiting for their turn. Someone will die, they'll step into a farm. It was 16% of households were landless in other colonies. In Molochna, it was 47%, 3 times as bad. Pretty soon, landlessness was passed down to the second and third generation. So this is a more permanent division of Mennonites into different economic classes in Russia than we ever saw in Poland or Prussia. Nonetheless, Mennonites are still much better off overall than their neighbors. And part of this is because Mennonites were really good at negotiating for themselves. If you look at this chart, so this lays out the taxes that were paid kind of annually as a percentage, so it kind of gives you an idea. From 1815 to 1862, when the tax tables were changed, you can see that Mennonites had, same income as others, but they paid lower taxes. They negotiated a lower tax rate with the government when they settled. And in fact, their tax rate was about the same as peasants who had, very little income. And these were a sort of a nomadic tribe that lived in the area, and they eventually all left and moved to the Ottoman Empire. So Mennonites were good negotiators on taxes, and that helped them some. In addition, when Mennonites came, they got loans from the government to get set up. So they get land to use for free. They get loans to get set up. None of this is available to local people. In Kortica, they could take until 1847, like over 50 years, to pay back their loans. They were interest-free. I would take that loan. In Molochna, the government eventually just forgave 20% of the loan. So Mennonites get a really good deal. And it puts them a step above their neighbors. Starting in 1836, they turned to commercial grain production. And the most important thing they figured out here is something they called black fallow. It was a system of crop rotation. So the idea is that 1/4 of your land, you just leave fallow every year. You don't plant everything there, and you don't let anything grow there. So the way they had been doing this was to sow a cover crop, let it grow, they'd graze that for a couple years, then they'd plow it up and farm it. And the new idea was to preserve moisture, don't let anything grow. That will preserve more moisture down below. And this apparently worked in those conditions. And so Johann Cornys sort of got this system started, and it worked actually really well. So by 1848, they had doubled the yield per acre following this system. And they were also plowing up more and more land and farming, so they're growing into a major grain-producing area because they figured out how to do this. Another thing that happened in 1836, they get this directive, start doing black fallow, and the government creates a new port. So you can see here's where they're growing grain, and they come down to Berdansk, and they can now ship to world markets, which they needed because it's harder to transport grain than wool, so you need a better way to get things to market. The other problem is that Australia now is growing lots of really cheap wool. They couldn't compete with that anyway. So they needed to switch markets, and they do that just in time, actually ahead of others as well. Eventually, this helps turn Ukraine into a major grain basket for all of the Russian Empire, and eventually for the whole world. So the climate conditions and the ground conditions, soil conditions here, are kind of unique. You can't do that too many places. Turns out Kansas is one of the Great Plains is kind of the other place. So Mennonites ended up in two really unique places in the world for making really huge scale grain production possible. And they made a lot of money at it. Now, the other thing you can do if you don't have enough land, of course, is to figure out some way to get into craft production. And Mennonites worked at that for a long time. And finally, in 1841, they set up a new settlement called New Halbstadt in Molochna, where all the craftsmen were supposed to go. And then they could make stuff and pool stuff together and then market it. They had, so this shows you where, it's like next to one of their biggest towns. There's a German Lutheran colony across the river. They could sell stuff over there. This is the idea. There's a number of breweries, vinegar manufacturer. There's a cloth factory here when the government puts this in place. Let's try to get everybody to centralize production in Neu-Halbstadt. They do that in 1841. 5 years later, they lift restrictions. Now you can sell anywhere, not just to other colonists. And that helps production to boom. By the 1870s, when Mennonites start leaving the Russian Empire for North America, Mennonite-owned flour mills are producing 1/3 of all the flour consumed in the 3 southern provinces of the Russian Empire. And Mennonite-owned factories are producing about 1/3 of all the farm implements. So fairly quickly, Mennonites go from nothing to major stakes in food processing and manufacture. They grew fantastically, comparatively wealthy in the Russian Empire because they're at the leading edge of agriculture and industry at the time that the Industrial Revolution or the Industrial Age comes to Russia. As a community, they're well integrated into local, regional, and the entire imperial economy. And that means that when they leave the Russian Empire and come here, economically, they're very different people in those 50 years. It's a rapid transformation. Well, what are we to make of all this? The recasting of Mennonite self-image in the Russian Empire might be one way to explain the phenomenon or the prominence of this short time in our history. Why do we think about it? Think about all those changes, how they came together. The outside pressure applied by imperial law to foreign colonists to live separately from everyone else was reinforced externally for 50 years. The internal theological preference we had to not marry others or to socialize only with Mennonites. The community had become a social construct overlaid on a theological foundation. Engaging in new churchly tasks outside of our own boundaries, like mission and Bible societies, provided this new social construct with a sense of Christian purpose directed towards an external activity. Education was also given religious meaning, as it joined family and congregation to become a new important location of Christian formation. At the same time, educated provided Mennonites with intellectual tools to conceive of themselves in an innovative, collective way, making education a new path to the kingdom of God for a community on the move. Being at the forefront of the explosion of wealth that accompanied the Industrial Revolution, provided Mennonites with the wherewithal and the habits of mind to build new institutions that would preserve Mennonite unity as they worked at the common task of equipping the next generation to serve God out in the world. From this perspective, nothing made more sense than to build a new school on the empty prairie starting just a dozen years or so after arriving in a new homeland. The community arrived newly formed and self-conscious. It knew what it wanted to do, and it remembers with fondness the time and the place where it came to think of itself as a community in the world, not just passing through on the way to heaven. We'll stop and take time for some question and answers, and then you'll be able to look over in the new exhibit and see how much of this you see playing out with what the immigrants brought. But I think we have time for questions.
Thank you, Mark. Today you're going to have to talk loudly, and then you'll need to repeat.
I'll repeat the question. So if there's a question and I can hear it, I will repeat it, and then we'll see what happens next.
In my mind, turkey red wheat played a larger role than I thought you were giving it. Now, maybe I'm incorrect in my assessment of it. So how do you place that in the economic growth of the Mennonites after 1830s or 40s?
Mm-hmm.
Rather?
So the question was, what was the role of turkey red wheat in the economic growth among Mennonites in the Russian Empire in the 1830s? And was it really such a large role? Maybe it was a smaller role. I'm not sure that I'm talking about grain production generally. I wouldn't link this exactly only to turkey red wheat. So they were growing other types of grain as well. Mm-hmm. But the grain production was really quite important. But it was a leg of the Mennonite economic income, but there were these other legs as well. And I don't know the percentages. It'd be interesting to figure that out. Yeah.
Is the land and in Ukraine presently similar to Kansas, or do they have more or less rainfall, better soil, similar soil? What's the agriculture comparative to Kansas as opposed to Ukraine?
So the question is, how does agriculture compare today between Ukraine and Kansas, if the soil and rainfalls are still similar or if they're different? I'm not a good person to ask that question. I've never been to Ukraine in my life. What little I know based on reading would suggest that they're still fairly similar. But maybe other people who've been to Ukraine have other ideas. I don't know.
But when we were there, the land looked just like Kansas.
So Richard was there. He says the land looks just like Kansas. So I think they were happy to come here because it looked just like Kansas. Oh, here's a mic. Okay, there's a question way in back. I don't know how you get now. How do you get the mic there?
So I'm just curious, somebody has probably done this work, what was the socioeconomic level of the ones who left in the 1874 migration?
So the question is, what was the social economic level of Mennonites who left in the 1874 migration, presumably compared to the ones who stayed? I actually am not real sure. I don't think there was a huge difference, would be my sense, although I think the ones that came would have been more likely to be rural than urban, and probably not quite as educated or not Russian-speaking. So it'd probably be more along those differences than on wealth per se.
Not like the landless would have been the ones more likely to come?
So the question, would the landless have been more likely to come? And again, I'm not probably the best person to answer that question. There are others who've done more work on this than me, but I don't think so. The landless were disproportionate in migrating from Poland to Kortica, and maybe also to Molochna, but I'm not sure that's true for leaving. That's a great question. I don't know for sure. There's a mic coming for you. They're going to make you talk into the mic.
Okay. Could you elaborate on the role of some of the key movers and shakers in the migration, in their first in their Russian setting, and then here, Cornelius Jantzen in particular, and maybe some of the other people who were, in a sense, the Mennonite sort of elite in Berzhansk and in Odessa and in Hauptstadt and other places.
Mm-hmm.
That group, and then they related to the railroad, Santa Fe Railroad agents, and ultimately Cornelius Jantzen was expelled from Russia by the Tsar's government for all of this activity. So who were the sort of key players,
Mm-hmm.
first in Russia and then here?
Yeah, that's a very big question. I don't know how long do we have yet. So it is true that you need good leadership to make large enterprises work. And Cornelius Jantzen was not a Russian citizen. He was a migrant from Prussia who was living in Verdansk, in that port city. And so he still had Prussian citizenship, but he'd been living in Russia for a long time, and worked in the grain trade. So he had connections, and he knew people. He knew people back in Prussia. There was a handful of them who'd come to the United States. So he wrote letters and asked what are conditions like in North America, and he had those printed up, and he was promoting migration, and he got kicked out for that. There were others, of course. Bernhard Warkentine came early, but then there were Mennonites here who helped them and welcomed them. So it's a really a big question. There were, of course, people who came in 1873 to visit here. So this was a large-scale, organized trip. They had to think about how do we get the poor people here. A lot of the work that was done was to organize to get money to help poor people. But there'd be probably more leadership than I could name, and more than I know a lot of specific details on. But that would be another useful way to tell the story and to connect it to your families. Where in your families are there connections to migration generally and maybe to the leadership more specifically? And of course, we had our good friend who led migration to the east, to Central Asia instead of coming here. So leadership of all kinds.
One more question, and then we will move. Got one way over there.
You had very briefly commented on people who were living in the Ukraine when the Mennonites came. Who were they? And what was the status of people moving into the Ukraine or Russia when it was presumably somewhat settled already?
Well, I would say it was inhabited, maybe not settled. So, one would have to look at each area of Mennonite settlement. The one that has been the best researched is Molochna, and in Molochna territory or just adjacent to it, there was this Nogai tribe that was mentioned because they had to also pay taxes. They were there. They were mostly pastoralist or nomadic, so they're moving through the area. All of this territory until fairly recently had been part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire won the war, took that territory, and then wanted people to settle it. And there weren't a lot of people there or a lot of cities. And so there were also, there was a lot of movement from all kinds of people into that area. In that way, it has some analogies, of course, to what happened here. Military moves people out, and the government invites other people to move in. And those people that are moved out, don't have large settlements or much or any say. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting analogy, or a interesting recurring tragedy.
All right, well, thought-provoking question to end our program. And thank you again to Mark, and take a minute to give your thanks.
I have one more thing I got to say.
Okay, go for it.
So as you heard, John Thiessen and I co-direct the Mennonite Polish Studies Association, and you saw that Mennonites spent 250 years in Poland. If you'd like to see that, John and I are leading a tour again this coming summer in June. Some people in the room have been on that tour. Some people in the room are going on that tour. So you could come talk to John or I or others who've been on the tour. There's also some information laying out on the front desk. So just another opportunity to learn about Mennonite history in a different way.
All right, thank you, Mark.